Right, everyone, welcome back to Black and Briefed, our history on the ballot. This is our fourth interview now, and I'm really excited to have this next interview with Miss Ruwa Romman. She is candidate for Georgia Senate, but she, if you actually recognize her, is a former candidate for Georgia governor. So we are going to kind of get into the nuts and bolts of what Georgia politics looks like and what her vision is. She is a Georgia State representative, a policy expert, and one of the most closely watched voices in Southern progressive politics. Born in Jordan and raised in Forsyth County, Georgia, she is the granddaughter of Palestinian refugees and a product of Georgia's public schools. She went on to earn her master's in public policy from Georgetown University and built a career advising government agencies as a senior consultant at Deloitte before turning her full attention to elected office. In 2022, she made history as the first Palestinian and Muslim woman elected to the Georgia General Assembly. Since then, she has authored legislation targeting corporate land grabs, posed a moratorium on unchecked data center expansion, fought to make EMS an essential service, and pushed to restore the State Consumer Protection Office, all while serving in the minority of a chamber Republicans have controlled for over 2 decades. She recently gained national attention in 2024 when she was denied a speaking slot at the Democratic National Convention, despite being put forward by the uncommitted movement, and still delivered the speech anyway, outside the doors of the United Center. Most recently, she withdrew from the 2026 race for governor of Georgia, but announced her candidacy for Georgia State Senate District 7 in Gwinnett County. She's here to talk about her record, her vision for Georgia, and what it actually takes to build political power in the South. So thank you again, Ruwa, for being here. Before we start, a quick note. This is a conversation that is educational in nature. It is not an endorsement of any candidate or party. Our goal, as always, is informed civic engagement. So welcome, Ruwa. Thank you for your time.
Thanks for having me.
I think I kind of want to get to what everyone is probably thinking about and asking about, which is this pivot that you recently did from running as a gubernatorial candidate to now running for state senate. And I know that part of the explanation that you gave was that it's very expensive to run a campaign. I think that politics makes it a little unattainable for the average person to actually take political office, but also that there are some powers that be in the background that are kind of moving things around in the political sphere. So let's be honest. How did you come to this probably very difficult decision, especially since you had gained so much momentum from a grassroots perspective? And why did you think that moving from the governor's mansion to state senate was the right move to make?
Yeah, so first and foremost, thank you so much for having me on. I'm really excited to get an opportunity to talk to folks because I do share the same passion of educating people, because I'm a firm believer that the more people understand these systems, the more power we have, because then we know what buttons we can push and levers we can pull. And so when I launched a campaign for governor last year, it was with an amazing team that has done so much with so little, with a very, very clear mission, which was that we deserve better. We deserve better as Georgians. We also deserve better as a party. I did not feel as if any of the candidates had been sort of pushing and fighting the way people were desperate for in this moment in particular. And the platform that we launched wasn't based off of a bunch of polling or testing. It was based off of doors that we've knocked over the past 10 years and continued to knock up until that point. And what was really incredible and what's tough about campaigns is that it's a slog. Most people are not paying attention until election season really comes around. But the reason you start so early is you want to try to reach as many people as possible and build the infrastructure necessary so that way when they do, there's sort of a moment that campaigns hit, right? Where it's kind of like slow, and then it just kind of shoots, right? And a lot of campaigns don't get that moment. We got it. We actually got it 2 weeks ago, and it was incredible. We had over 1,000 people sign up to volunteer in about a week, which was the largest increase in the shortest amount of time. According to our opponent's own internal polling, we were the only campaign really gaining and moving. So folks hearing this are probably thinking, what in the world? Why did you drop out? And truly, there was nothing, no plan, no long-term whatever that this was going to be how it ends. Monday morning, we were actually prepping last week. So this would have been the last week of February. We were prepping to do kind of a big qualifying rally. Qualifying is this week. It's when you put your name on the ballot. And Monday morning, I get a call letting me know that there is a super PAC out there that is going to be supporting Jeff Duncan with anywhere from $5-10 million already amassed in funding. And again, to me, I'm one of those people that if I see a fire or a challenge, I'm going to run right at it. So my immediate thinking was, we're going to rally the troops because I'm a deep believer that the many can absolutely defeat the money. The problem was, as I called some of our partners, people whose endorsements we were working really hard to earn, especially organizations, that was when we were told that a lot of the funding that they themselves had expected actually went to North Carolina and Texas. The sad reality about funders and donors is that they go by the headlines. Whether we like it or not, that's the truth, even though our state is primed for flipping the state house and the governor's mansion, as well as keeping Senator Ossoff in his seat. And it was just deeply disappointing because that was the moment we realized that, there just, not only was there no path, what we had built was no longer sustainable until we could get the funding we needed. And that kind of funding isn't going to come to a campaign. And we really sat with it. We thought, okay, what if we just go out in glory, fight really hard, do all that we can, and kind of see where it leads us. But the reality is that would have been a temporary, frankly, moment. And then what, right? We would have built a movement, and then people would have felt so defeated and angry when we knew logistically what is required for a campaign like this to have a shot. And we came to it was Monday morning, tried calling donors and funders all day Monday into Tuesday. And then a lot of them had asked if I would be willing to run in my state Senate seat that I live in currently, because Senator Parks was going to be running for higher office. And with the rising tide of anti-Muslim legislation and stuff coming out of the Senate, the community was really scared. They really said, please run for this, and spoke to my team, and we realized I'm actually over 3 separate state house seats. 2 of them are the 2 most flippable seats. And so we thought, okay, what is the best way to keep this movement going is by supporting really good candidates. And in the meantime, continuing to fight in the legislature where we desperately need people to keep fighting for us.
So I will admit that I was heartbroken because, again, I found you after you had a stellar performance in the DeKalb Democratic debate. And I was very impressed because I felt as though you were the only candidate who was actually asking the questions. It did not feel rehearsed. It didn't feel like party talking points. It felt like you had done your research. Like you said, you had knocked on the doors, you had talked to Georgians about what mattered most. And I think in this moment, as the Democratic Party, at least the members of the Democratic Party who identify as Democrats, as their interests start to shift or we become a little bit more loud about the direction we want to see the party going, you are one of the only people who was actually speaking to that shift. So admittedly, it was a disappointment to see, especially since you had gained so much momentum. I know that these are slightly different circumstances, but one of the things that comes to mind is the recent election of Zohran Mamdani as mayor of New York City and the stance that the party took on supporting him. But the fact that he was able to build this grassroots campaign where New Yorkers were just excited and turned out in record numbers to vote for him. And now he is actively acting on his policy points. Do you think, in retrospect, maybe there was a chance that the same could have been done for your campaign?
Thank you for asking that question, because I want to be clear, I'm crushed, right? It's not as if I'm happy about this or that this isn't, I really mean it. We were going, exactly what you said, we were starting to gain. The difference, though, is that Zohran, who is someone that I have known well before anyone else did, right? He's someone who I was intimately familiar with the back end of his campaign, the front of his campaign, every part of that campaign and how he got to where he did. The reality was that New York has what's called a matching program, where for every dollar he raised, he got 8 in return. So he raised about $1 million, got 8 million by the end of it. We were getting nowhere near that. And we didn't need it, by the way, because Georgia's entire primary is 1/3 the size of New York City's. And we knew the power of grassroots. That's why we started Field First. That's why we were able to recruit 5,000 volunteers. We had been door knocking in Atlanta, Athens, Savannah, Norcross, and Smyrna since November. We just added on Middle Georgia in Warner Robins, Perry, Columbus. Our next stops were going to be Dalton and Valdosta. We were doing what I jokingly called the reverse sandwich method. It's not as if we don't believe in grassroots organizing, but even for someone like Zohran, he's still had money to pay for ads. He still had money to pay for his literature, for his staff, for, the most basic of things that are necessary to get your name out there, which again, we can work around. We don't need to raise 8 million. We didn't even need to raise, 5 to 10. We just needed to raise a little bit of that. And the other piece to this, to be also frank with you, is that there are a lot of people that believed, and then there were a lot more people that didn't. And they kept insisting on sending their money to either other places in the country or other candidates in this field. And by the time they realized what we were doing, they'd already given their money away and it was too late. And so, if there's I'm always a sort of, what lesson can we learn? And then what can we do to prevent this from ever happening in the future? That's why we are planning long term. That's why we're building long term, to ensure this never happens again. That if we do have really great and promising candidates, that we support them and that they win their elections, which is again why we are continuing to mobilize our volunteers, why we've kept sort of a lot of that infrastructure. We have to figure out legally where we're going to put it in terms of an organization. But other than that, I mean, at the end of the day, I think the difference between us and Zoran was he had that initial investment that we never got.
That's understandable. And I think that that is really important information, especially for the electorate, because a lot of people don't understand how campaign finance works, how much it costs to run a campaign, how much it costs to run ads, especially when you're running against those who have PAC money. So they just have the millions of dollars to run a big ad during the Super Bowl or buy billboards. You might not have that. And that plays a huge role. On that note, I know that you were very transparent about some dark money that's being used in the gubernatorial campaign and who it's backing. With that being said, that is a huge touch point, especially for those of us who identify as Democrats and progressives, the presence of corporate money in our political sphere and how it influences those who are supposed to be working for our best interests. So I guess just straight up, do you accept corporate PAC money? And what do you feel the role of corporate money should be in politics and specifically in Georgia politics?
Yeah, so we actually very publicly stated from the very beginning our pledge to not accept a single dime from corporate PAC funding. And we even went a step further. So even though this is a state level race, APAC is federal, but there are sort of the equivalent of that on a state level. So the pro-Israel organization here is called Georgia Solidarity Network. I've never accepted a cent from them. I'll never accept a cent from them. And so when we talk to folks about the kind of funding that is sort of coming through, we were very honest from the very beginning that we're not going to do that. And I want to be clear, you can win without PAC funding, right? There are donors out there that you can talk to. You just need to kind of convince them that there's a path here. And so for us, it was that, I think it was just two very big hills to climb. And at the end of the day, no, we do not. And I have been trying to educate folks on what that means, what that looks like.
So you co-founded the Georgia Volunteer Hub and you helped train thousands of volunteers ahead of the 2020 runoff, which was such an important election. And I think that is the election that put Georgia on the map and identified Georgia as a state that could definitely flip blue and has in a lot of ways. What did doing that work teach you about power that you couldn't have learned inside of the legislature?
Yeah, so actually the first door I ever knocked was 2014. The Michelle Now and Jason Carter campaign had sent folks to our campus asking if we want to be politically engaged. And my friends and I weren't really sure what that looks like. We went down to headquarters. This was before you had an app. And they gave us a sheet of paper. You go knock doors, you fill it out, you come back, you turn it in. And I remember falling in love from the first door knock. And I went back to headquarters and I said, I really think if we can grow this around the state, we can flip our state blue. And I kid you not, this is no exaggeration. It was the first time anyone ever said to me, bless your heart. And I took that shit personally, so personally. I really think, I was joking earlier last week about how I'm leaning into what I call spiteful optimism. There are a lot of people that want us to be cynical and angry. And I feel like every time I've had that moment, I've always just leaned into that spiteful optimism. Like, I'm actually going to show you that you're wrong. And so I was deeply lucky because this was around the time that my friend Aisha Yacoub, for example, ran in my current state house seat. It was just drawn differently. Then she started the Georgia Muslim Voter Project. Then you had folks like Stacey Abrams who were really building that infrastructure. I mean, she came within a point, right? People often forget that before Stacey, we were losing by 20 to 10 points, depending on, whether it was an incumbent or non-incumbent. So it's not as if, I'm not here to deny that sexism or racism exists, but she got us the closest we'd ever gotten on a state level. And so I've always been somebody that, because of that experience, I actually watched how you can change an entire state, one cycle at a time, one door at a time, one conversation at a time. I think that has been the best lesson I could have learned. And I'm actually deeply grateful that I didn't grow up, quote unquote, in politics, because after that experience, I did a lot of community work, a lot of organizing work, a lot of just, I worked for CARE Georgia, and it was during the first Trump administration. So we were fighting the Muslim ban. My connections were deep, and they were community centered. So that way, when I was bullied into running for office the first time and I came into this building, my anchors were my community and my people and those who just weren't in this world, compared to a lot of people who grow up in politics. And you can kind of tell they're not really sure where their footing is, what their beliefs are. People kept coming up to me saying, it's so refreshing to hear you talk. And as sweet as that was, I actually would get angry because it showed me that the bar is in hell and yet we can't even meet it. And I don't understand. And so, I think that has been probably one of the best lessons is that, and Republicans do this really well, right? They are coordinated, but also they're polished, but in an unpolished way. It's hard to explain, but they really talk about what they believe. They don't always have to poll test everything because before elections, especially a year out, 2 years out, 8 months out, polls are like thermostats. You can change the temperature. As you get closer, they become closer to thermometers, but I think we need to relearn the concept of persuasion and talking to people. And so I think that has been sort of the best lesson I've ever learned.
So I do think that this is a sentiment that's kind of been floating, especially since the 2024 election, that the Democratic Party is they're just not meeting the moment. They are playing to an older type of politics that worked at a time that has since passed. And that the new generation that makes up the majority of the electorate now is not looking for politics as usual. Do you think that the party is missing on messaging? Are they missing in their methodology, or are they missing in actual policy that they're pushing forward, or maybe a combination of all three?
So I love to educate. Whenever I'm asked about the party, I always have to explain the DNC is for presidentials, right? That is national. Then you have the DSCC, which is responsible for Senate races. And then I think it's like the DRSC. I can't remember what the House of Representatives one is. But point is, each of these organizations is responsible for a different level of government. In Georgia, we have the Democratic Party of Georgia. That's the statewide. And then basically you have the different caucuses. So you have the Senate Minority Caucus and the House Minority Caucus, because when the minorities is Democrats, and they're responsible for state House and state Senate races. And I think it's a couple of things. One, we don't have funding, right? The Republicans have $5 million in each of their caucuses. We've got maybe $200,000, right? There's a huge funding and infrastructure difference. The second piece to this that I think is very important to talk about is that we have got to have a real conversation about what do we believe. Because I think people have been so desperate for a big tent, trying to go after the quote unquote ex-Republicans that barely exist instead of missing out on this massive opportunity. We have one of the youngest populations in the country. And we just continue to lean, like you said, in the old way of politics. And so when people talk about party, the part I can talk about and the part that I have any influence over is state level and particularly county level. And it's made up of us. The reality is that these parties are made up of people that show up. Gwinnett Dems meets once a month, right? If you show up into a Gwinnett Dem party and a meeting and you show up consistently and you offer to write newsletters and be helpful, you can probably end up being in leadership within a year. And that's the thing that I think people sometimes forget, is that the reason it feels so old and stale is because it's been the same people. And it's become this self-fulfilling prophecy where people feel so let down and turned off, they don't want to show up anymore. So then the people that show up are the ones we disagree with, and then so on and so forth and so on and so forth. And this is why primaries are so important. A lot of our elections are gerrymandered, so by the time you get to the general, the party that's going to win is pretty clear, with few exceptions, to be clear. And so getting involved in primaries is huge because turnout is low, so your voice has a bigger impact. And two, that's when you really get to decide where a party is going. If you're at the general, your job is to just prevent bad. But when you're in the primary, that's when you can set the benchmark, and that's why I initially ran for governor.
So you mentioned that you are in the minority. What do you want everyday people to understand about how legislation actually gets passed and how it dies? Whether or not it's in the public vote, in committee assignments, on the calendar, at the speaker's discretion. I think that American politics specifically makes it extremely hard for legislation to actually get passed. But as a member of the general public, if you don't understand exactly what this process looks like and how bills fail, then it can just feel like you're voting people in that are not actually doing anything. So what do you want people to know about how legislation, specifically in Georgia, gets passed or failed?
I actually keep saying this sentiment about Zoran because you mentioned him earlier about how it turns out you can just do things.
Yeah.
But that's actually why we should take executive offices seriously. We talk a lot about Congress. Sometimes we talk about the state legislature and we get a little bit of attention, but we need to start also talking about executive offices, mayors, county commissioners, gubernatorials, you name it. And I think so that's like bucket number one is if you want things that are done somewhat quickly or at least with some expediency or leadership or one megaphone, that's what executive offices are about. The presidency, the mayorals, the gubernatorials, etc. On a legislative perspective, you now have to move in Congress there's 400 people, 400 plus people in the House. In Georgia, there's about 180 of us. There's a few vacancies right now, but there's about 180 of us. And you have to convince 180 people to vote for your bill. And before you even get to that point, it gets assigned to a committee and the chairman has to agree to even hear your bill and put you on the agenda and talk about what you're doing. And so when you're in the minority, rarely do our bills even get a hearing, let alone make it all the way to the House for a vote. Rarely do we get that opportunity. And so oftentimes it's not a cop-out. When you're in the minority, whether in Congress or the legislature, when we say we don't have a lot of power, it's true. But where I think we should be doing things differently is introduce and message on legislation anyway. I introduced my data center moratorium knowing that it wasn't going to go anywhere. But then what ended up happening was 7 other states introduced their own. And we were the first, right? You actually can inspire other states that can pass the legislation to do some of that work. One of the things that we kept hearing about was ICE and ICE detentions, and people are really scared. Last year, my colleagues, Gabe Sanchez introduced a bill to unmask ICE and force them to identify themselves. And then Representative Bryce Berry introduced legislation that I co-sponsored that bans them from hospitals and houses of worship and schools, right? Became a conversation starter for this year. Our Senate colleagues then took it on. And then next thing you knew, other places around the country were doing something similar. And so oftentimes, yes, we're in the minority, but at bare minimum, I think our job is to try to shift the conversation and be creative about what's possible, because if and when we do get the majority, we've already talked about these bills, we've already considered these bills, tweak them with legislative counsel on those bills, and then we can introduce them on day one.
So I want to go back to the issue of voting because you made a really good point that we need to focus on changing what these executive offices look like and who holds them. But many of those executive offices, with the exception of the president, are done during midterm elections, which traditionally do not have the same level of turnout. Going back to the issue of funding, and part of, I think, what the problem was with your governor's race was the fact that the party decides what races they want to fund based on name recognition, likelihood that this will actually go the way that we want to. And it almost feels like sensationalism or like a popularity contest. And I think personally, for someone who is born and raised in the South, I'm an Atlanta transplant, but I came from Florida. People always have this attitude of like, oh, the South is just going to vote red all the time, so we shouldn't even waste our time. Sometimes they joke like you should just cut them off the map because they always vote red. But the reality is that there are so many of us who are blue. There's so many of us who are blue dots in a red state, and voter suppression is real. What do you think is the most pressing issue when it comes to voter suppression here in Georgia, and how do we create some type of plan to overcome it as we're going into our own midterms?
Until we can take the majority and stop a lot of these bills, and we've been able to overturn a lot of them due to constitutional merit, but until those things happen, the sad reality is we've got to start tuning in. And I know in our information environment that can be very difficult. And what I've recommended that people do is find organizations that share your values, right? Working Families Party, Georgia Conservation Voters, Asian American Advocacy Fund. There are so many organizations out there who will send out reminders about primaries and will send out reminders about general elections and will actually just give you the details. Some of them will endorse candidates, because the way that works is we go through an endorsement process. We sit down for interviews, they ask us questions. So when I say find an organization that shares your values, it's because when they endorse somebody, they're endorsing them based off of those values. And my argument to folks is until these people are out of power, they're going to try to keep us out of power. And we do have an obligation to be informed. We do have an obligation to be involved. And it's so important. Make a group chat, right? If you are the person who kind of knows all things elections, have a group chat whose only job is you're just texting your friends and family about, hey, go vote on this date at this time, right? That is the only way we're going to get around this. Until things significantly and systemically change, we're basically just going to have to look out for each other and turn each other out.
You've pushed legislation to address corporate ownership of single-family homes and restore the state's Consumer Protection Office. What is the legal mechanism behind those bills, and why has Georgia's Republican majority consistently blocked them?
It's really funny. When we first launched our gubernatorial campaign, a lot of Republican statewide candidates also started saying the same things we were saying, especially on taking homes back from corporate landlords and the data center piece of it. So it's always been fascinating to me that they have the complete and total majority, and yet none of the data center bills have passed. Senator Hofstetler, who's a Republican, has been working on 2 bills related to data centers and the Consumer Utility Council. I introduced a sister bill in the House, and it hasn't moved. It was supposed to come for a vote last week, and they killed it, and no one knows why. And again, they have total control. And that really goes to show how captured Republicans are to special interests, because they'll campaign on this stuff during campaign season. They'll talk about healthcare. They'll talk about data centers. They'll talk about corporate-owned housing. They'll talk about all this kind of stuff. And then as soon as push comes to shove, when they have control over every branch of government, federally and statewide, suddenly something happened, or we're not sure what it is, or whatever the case may be. I think sometimes that can be so dejecting to a lot of voters. They're like, well, nothing's going to change. But the reality is, I'll be honest with you, I'd much rather be under a Democratic administration in Georgia any day of the week than whatever this is, because the conversations we'd be having are so different. So yes, I introduced the bill to close a tax loophole, because right now we incentivize corporations to buy homes, which is nuts. The Consumer Utility Council, their job was to, if you get a crazy high bill, you could take it to them and they would fight on your behalf for free. The data center moratorium was to prevent the permanent altering of our state before we had proper regulations for data centers. All of these bills that we've done, I remember I've co-sponsored gun safety legislation. I have worked on voting rights bills, because I actually got my master's in public policy and my focus was voting rights. My thesis was on the Voting Rights Act and specifically voter ID laws. And so for us, it's how do we continue to fight systemically while empowering people to know their power, even under systems that try to silence them.
I think this housing issue is so big because it is ridiculous the amount of construction that is happening in the metro Atlanta area. But this was the first time I've ever seen new build subdivisions that are rent only. I thought that was absolutely bonkers. And it's definitely an issue that needs to be put under control. But I'm glad that you brought up the data center issue, because that is something that is relatively new, I think, to the general public, but it has been in the works for quite some time. Now, most people don't immediately connect data centers to community harm. Make the case for why this is a public issue and a people issue, especially for Black and Brown communities in Georgia.
Yeah, so poor communities generally, there are places in Georgia where data centers have popped up and now the water pressure has completely disappeared almost, right? It's down to a trickle. People have complained about sediment in their water. In Noonan, this has been a huge issue for them in particular, because the new data center, local businesses, especially coffee shops or restaurants, keep talking about how they can't run their business. A lot of it is taken up by data centers. People don't realize, for example, if we had a drought tomorrow, data centers get priority for water over farms. And so we forget that there's real implications to these things. Not only that, but the regulations we're asking for are actually pretty simple. They cannot be near homes. They should have what's called a closed cooling system, so that way they're not taking up a ton of water unnecessarily. That if they do enter a community, are they taking up too much water? Can the community actually handle it? Do they have enough water? This is the first year where we're not in active litigation on the tri-state water wars. These data centers are going to risk that. That litigation is very expensive, and it's between us, I think it's Alabama and Florida. To me, it's no one wants this, right? They're doing this to prop up AI, which is going to take over our jobs. It's already taking our art. It has really muddled the truth. And on top of literally all of this, they also want us to they keep saying these data centers have good revenue streams for local communities. But what they do is that might be the case for a year or two, and then they set their infrastructure saying that equipment is depreciating. So whatever tax revenue that city or county is going to get suddenly turns into a tax credit for the data center. And I just think we need regulations to prevent those things before we permanently say yes to them.
Absolutely. I know I live on the South Side, and this is a consistent complaint by a lot of us that there are data centers that they want to build here, but you cannot control, or you claim that you can't control the price of our utility bills already. So who foots the bill for all this water and all this electricity, on top of the fact of No one's asking the question, at least the right parties are not asking the question of what is the environmental harm? What is this going to do to the communities? And I think that it's very telling where they want to put these data centers and the makeup of the people that live in those communities. Is this something that I know there are a few different bills by a few different congressional members either asking for moratoriums or to stop data centers altogether? Is this something that even looks like it could be possible under the current political climate in Georgia?
I mean, this is the bipartisan issue, right? We heard it in rural, urban, suburban areas, and my call to action has been, if you know anyone, regardless of political affiliation, especially in these Republican districts, have them reach out, right? Like, that is the only pressure these people understand, is one that threatens their power. Qualifying ends tomorrow at noon. If any of these people have been ignoring our asks about data centers, come down to the Capitol and qualify to run against them. If nothing else, it forces them to run a better campaign and listen to their constituents. But the reality is that we need to advocate. You got to email, make the phone calls, come down here if you can, talk to your elected officials, because you can do that. At a state level, you can actually just show up. But when you reach the limit of that, the next best thing is getting them out of power.
So I want to shift to the big DNC moment that kind of gave you some national spotlight, and kind of go back to the discussion of what are party interests and what is the party really pushing. So at the 2024 DNC, you were denied a speaking slot. This is something that a lot of us heard, but we may not have truly understood what was going on at the time. Ironically enough, though, it was the same day that Jeff Duncan, the architect of the Georgia heartbeat bill, and also someone who has since flipped to identifying as a Democrat and is now running for the governor's mansion in Georgia, he was allowed on that stage. What does that sequence of decisions tell us about who the Democratic Party actually believes it needs to be protected?
Yeah, and sorry if there's background noise. I think the governor's helicopter is landing. This is our world. You know, that time in my life and that year genuinely is the hardest I've ever experienced, because when you're a state rep, most people don't know your name. We don't even have staff, right? Like, if you want staff, you fundraise for it, and that's how you get staff. I remember at that time, I went to Chicago for a panel with Arab American Institute. Not ironically, but makes perfect sense that it was hosted by the Push Rainbow Coalition. And I remember very clearly the panel was called Voices You Will Not Hear at the DNC. And it was just one of those moments, right? Like, it was a moment that really kind of spoke to what was happening. And one of the uncommitted organizers, they'd been interviewed almost every day, and they were being asked about, are you going to get a speaker? Because that was one of their asks. They had a bunch of policy asks and then some symbolic ones, including having a speaker on stage. And to be clear, for 2 minutes and not even during prime time, it was such a basic ask. And they said, and that was, I think one of the anchors had asked, well, can you give us some examples of names that you had recommended? Because this has been in negotiations for months. I want to be clear. This was not, they showed up and demanded a speaker. I've seen people put out some of the most insane conspiracy theories about this, and allegedly people who are Democrats, talking about how, uncommitted was just there to ruin the DNC. I mean, these were people that had done a protest vote, because if you read Harris's book, she talks about how Biden was being insulated about his own polling numbers. And the only language they understand is straight up votes sometimes. And the uncommitted movement was so popular, they actually got seated delegates. It takes a lot to get to that point. And so they were negotiating. My name pops publicly. I'm a state representative from a swing state, and a lot of elected officials felt like I could be someone they could vouch for, right? Because we're fellow elected officials. We kind of, we're all in this weird world together. And suddenly members of Congress were demanding that I get a speaking slot. And a bunch of them were like, well, if we do get you on there, what would you say? So I literally typed up a draft on my phone. I was sitting in my hotel room trying to figure out, am I going home? Am I not going home? I had to change my flight several times, my hotel several times, which was a pain to do, by the way, during that weekend. And next thing I know, my name was everywhere. And Wednesday night, that was, we were being told by the DNC, because at that point, I'm just like hanging out with the uncommitted folks every day. Like, okay, what am I doing? Am I going home? Am I staying? What's going on? And we got word Wednesday night that there would be no slot for a Palestinian speaker. And I remember my friend Abbas, who was one of the uncommitted folks, lost it. Because the reality was Israel had started bombing South Lebanon. That was his home. And he had felt like he had pushed every button, pulled every lever, that something was going to come through. And the fact that we couldn't even get a symbolic speaker for 2 minutes on that stage, I think really hit home for him just how immovable this was going to be. And he went to United Center because we were doing an interview together. So he runs over to United Center. We all chase after him after we're done. And that's when he started the sit-in. It wasn't planned. The outdoor sit-in was not planned. None of that was planned. And I was there to make sure my friends were okay. You mentioned this, so I'm going to talk about it, which is that there were screens outside. We're watching the DNC. And then we see Jeff Duncan on that screen. And that's when I joined the sit-in. Because I knew in that moment we were going to lose. I knew that when you are willing to platform Liz Cheney and agents from Customs Border Patrol and Jeff Duncan, that we had not learned a single lesson. And that the people running Harris's campaign, which were Biden's team, by the way, were they would rather us lose than ever admit they were wrong. Ever. And it was infuriating. And it was awful. And we did all that we could. My speech leaked. We still don't know how it leaked, but it leaked. And so that was why Thursday, on the last day of the convention, I was asked to read it outside.
So with that being said, I know that the war in Gaza has been what people are calling a litmus test for how they are viewing candidates of all races moving forward, whether or not we're on the federal level or even state level. We haven't seen much improvement at all since the 2024 election, and of course, the shift and transition into the new administration. And this, I know, sits at a very touchy intersection for you because this is a part of your lived experience and your identity. Reality is that it was a litmus test for Kamala Harris. It was something that was used against her position on Israel and whether or not Israel should be able to continue to get weapons using taxpayer money. And it hit on all sides for both brown and Black communities. So in this moment, where we are still kind of having candidates who are playing politics as usual, what do you tell the Democratic voters about how they should be using issues as litmus tests?
Yeah, I think this has been the hardest part about all of this, is that it's a genocide. I mean, I know people try to obfuscate what it is. It's a genocide. The Israeli officials were very clear. The thing about genocide that's really hard to prove is intent, and they broadcasted it every day and have been since then. It was a war of annihilation. Rafah is a city that's thousands of years old, and it's been leveled. I don't know what else you call that. And the hardest part when it came to the presidential in 2024 was, and I've tried to explain this to people, is that primaries are when you can set the pieces on the board, and the general election is where you have to hold the position that you were able to win in the primaries. By that point, it was too late. It was too late to make an argument that we can punish a candidate. If you want to punish a candidate, the best way to do that is replace them with someone better. If you replace them with someone worse, you're not getting what you want, because the lesson that was learned, and we have to argue this with some of the worst consultants in the world that know the electorate is not more conservative. The electorate was pissed, and that was really frustrating. And so what I've tried to explain to people is that have litmus tests. Those are really important, but they need to happen in the primaries. Oftentimes what I've noticed is that people love to talk about who we shouldn't vote for. It would have been completely changing if more people talked about our campaign and what we were building and why people should vote for those candidates, right? You have Abdul Sayed in Michigan. You had, and you still have me in Georgia. You have Kat Abu Ghazaleh up in Illinois. You have, there's a bunch of Palestinian electeds. There's Iman Jude in Colorado, Abdul Nasser also in Illinois. You have Sam Rasool in Virginia. There are a lot of candidates up and down the ballot that are running, that are not taking corporate PAC money, that are not taking pro-Israel money, that have called this a genocide, that have called for the end of weapons. And I'm not saying that they have the perfect record, but for two senators of a swing state, ours have punched well above their weight, right? We are one of 5 states where both of our senators voted yes on limiting weapons to Israel. One of 5, and we're a swing state. And so what I try to tell folks is, if this has become something that's moved you, I am so deeply grateful. And also, I need people to see how much we've moved on this issue, because in the past, it was maybe 5 House members that would vote no on weapons to Israel and maybe 1 senator. Then it came down to 2 or 3. By the end of it, we had, I think, almost 20 senators voting the way we wanted them to, and the majority of the Democratic House caucus. On a state level, it was like 70 of the almost 90 members were voting the way I wanted them to, or at least straight up refusing to vote on some of these things. I have a hard time believing that doesn't mean anything. And I would really, really hate for people to give up right as we're at that tipping point of winning. Because this is what happened to the NRA. The NRA used to play in Democratic politics, and we got rid of them. Now, if a single candidate gets NRA money, that's an immediate disqualifier. We're getting there. It sucks. We don't have time, but it does take time. And my ask to people is, this is what I've been calling spiteful optimism. There's a lot of people that want you to give in and believe this is the way it's always going to be. But I cannot explain enough how much things have already changed. And if we just lean in a little harder and continue building that infrastructure, we're going to get to a point where, I pray to God that we get to that point of like making sure this never happens again.
So now I want to shift back to your policy, which I'm sure probably hasn't changed too much, even though you're running a different type of campaign. What are your probably top 3 to 5 areas of interest or concern should you get this state Senate seat? What are the top 3 or 5 things that you personally know you want to work on walking into that seat?
Yeah, the benefit of being a consistent person and someone with like a moral compass is I made the joke the other day that all I had to do for our website was control F governor and replace it with state Senate.
Literally.
Because it was
same website.
It was informed. Like I cannot stress enough how much this was informed by people, right? Like it was for us a thing that was informed by our voters, for our voters, and it hasn't changed. So for us, it's take homes back from corporate landlords, reopen hospitals, feed hungry kids, press pause on data centers. It's those things that continue to be big issues that matter the most for so many people. And those are things I'm gonna keep working on. And that's not going to change.
I love that. I think that one of the most endearing things, and I was actually just talking to my boyfriend about it, is like when I read your policy platform and I go on your website, I feel like I'm talking to my friend about the things that I want to see change versus being like, and I'm a lawyer, so it's not like I can't get through the legalese of it all. But I don't want to be talked to like that by someone that I'm voting for and is supposed to be working for my best interest. I want you to talk to me like I'm a normal person, because I am. You've navigated being a first, a fighter, and a target all at once and in public. What do you want people watching you, especially young women, Muslim women, children of immigrants, to take from how you navigate all of those hats?
Yeah, I mean, fundamentally, one thing I've told people as we're running statewide, and I still do today, is that I fundamentally believe that in times of fear and in times of great adversity, it is the time to be brave. And I always invite people to be brave with me. And that is what I tell them, is that you just have to be brave. Because it came up earlier, I remember when I was really being pushed into running for office, my grandfather had just passed away. And I told my community members, I said, I can't be your Palestinian rep. I just can't. It's going to be a massive open wound. I can't do it. And within a year, that was all anyone ever knew about me, which is kind of weird how the world works that way. And there were times where I remember, especially that end of 2023, I seriously thought about resigning. I remember thinking, I don't know if I can do this. I really, really don't. And same thing, that spiteful optimism of, do I really want my opposition to outlast me? And so that's what I always tell folks is, one, there is no ceiling for us. People like to imply there are ceilings. There are no ceilings. Again, we were the only gubernatorial campaign gaining in a statewide race. I'm a first-time statewide candidate. I've never run a statewide race in my life. And yet we had 5,000 volunteers, only campaign to be moving positively in the polls, only campaign to be moving people. And I look the way that I do very publicly. And I want to be clear, we talked, again, to people all around the state. I graduated in the same high school as Marjorie Taylor Greene. I'm very well aware of the realities of our world. And also, I would meet people at rest stops, at gas stations, at the events that we were at. Some of them might have questions about my identity. When we would talk about things like data centers, when we talk about things like wages, when we talk about those things that really matter, that is what kept me going. Even when people like Laura Loomer and all those crazy people kept trying to dox us, I remember I told folks, because people would say, aren't you scared? Like, yes, one dangerous person with a gun can do a lot. Ever. I remember one time she doxed an event and I think maybe 2 people showed up. You would think from our social media that we would have protesters, masses of them everywhere we went, but it was the complete opposite. People showed up with curiosity, and because of that authenticity, it went such a long way. And so when people try to figure out this inside-outside tension, yeah, the tension is there, but I have never regretted leaning into what's right. ever.
So what does your district look like in 3, 4, 5 years' time under your leadership should you win the Senate seat?
Yeah, so my hope is a few things. First and foremost, that we get a lot more activism from our district in terms of people getting involved, coming down to the Capitol, pushing on issues. But also, my district sits on 2 of the top 5 most flippable state house races. I'm an organizer. And so our goal is to also help flip those seats and for that district to really be represented by people who have their best values at heart and not whatever it is the other two folks who are Republican are doing these days. Again, I really would love for it to be a place that becomes a hub for organizing and for people to sort of learn their power, because where Gwinnett goes, so goes the state. And if we are not turning out our voters in Gwinnett, there is no winning Georgia. And I think that there's just so much potential and possibility there for us. And also, again, being able to work with those city council members, with county commissioners, the way I've been doing already, to make sure they're getting the funding they need to fight back on bad bills that can harm them, things like that.
So you guys, this is Rep. Ruwa Romman. She is running for state senate for Georgia. Ruwa, what do people need to know about midterms? What are the important dates? Where can they find you and how can they support your campaign?
All right, so get ready, y'all. I need you to get these dates in your calendar. So April 20th is the last day to register to vote and update your voter registration. So if you're going to move between now and then, please make sure that you are updating that information. You can do so at mvp.sos.ga.gov. Secondly, early voting starts April 27th, and the last day to vote in the primaries will be May 19th. Primaries are basically Democrat versus Democrat, Republican versus Republican. So if you really want to push and get the best possible option, primaries are best time to do that. Now, if there are more than 2 candidates, there's going to be runoffs in June, on June 16th. So those are the biggest, between now and June, those are your most important deadlines and dates. Now, in terms of where you can find us, visit ruwaforgeorgia.com. That's RUWA. FORGEORGIA.com. You can pledge to donate. We're in the middle of session, so I can't actually fundraise, but you can pledge to donate. You can sign up to volunteer. We're door knocking on Saturday. We have not skipped a single weekend of door knocking. Last weekend, we went door knocking for Audrey, who has a special election on March 10th. But we're going to be really going hard on the doors for us starting this weekend and also other candidates. So please sign up to volunteer. We also have Tuesday night phone banking. We train you. You don't have to know anything. We will make sure you have all the tools. Come and join us and follow us on social media. It's my first and last name, RUWA ROMMAN, everywhere that you're on social media.
So Ruwa, thank you so much for your time. Thank you for talking to the audience of Black and Briefed. I am personally very inspired by you, and I wish you the best of luck in this race.
Thank you.